Have you ever woken up one morning and realized that the fire you once carried for life has quietly burned out? Not dramatic, not painful enough to cry about, just gone. You look at your phone, scroll through messages you don't feel like answering. You think about your goals, and they feel like someone else's dreams. You sit across from people you love, and part of you is somewhere else, watching from a distance. And the question that keeps circling back isn't what's wrong with me, but something far more unsettling. Who is this person I've become? Or more accurately, who is this person I'm no longer? There's a strange silence that settles in when you stop caring about the things that once defined you. It's not depression in the clinical sense. You can still function. You still show up. You still laugh when it's expected. But underneath all of that, there's a quiet withdrawal happening, like a tide pulling back from a shore you thought you'd always stand on. And the world has 1,000 labels for this state. Burnout, midlife crisis, lack of motivation, loss of purpose. But what if none of those labels are accurate? What if this experience isn't a problem to be solved, but a message to be decoded? Carl Jung, one of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, looked at this exact state through a completely different lens. Where modern psychology sees disengagement, Jung saw redirection. Where self-help gurus see a motivation deficit, Jung saw a soul demanding a new kind of attention. He believed that when you begin to lose interest in everything, you haven't lost anything at all. You've simply reached the end of a chapter that your deeper self is ready to close. In this video, we're going to walk through this territory step by step, not to pull you out of it quickly, not to give you 5 steps to get your motivation back, but to help you understand why this is happening, what it's revealing about your inner life, and why Jung considered this the most misunderstood gateway to genuine transformation. If you're in this space right now, feeling like you're floating through your own existence, this might be the most honest conversation you've had in a long time. Let's begin. Section 1. The quiet withdrawal. There's a kind of collapse that everyone recognizes. You lose your job. A relationship ends. Someone you love passes away. These are events with clear before and after pictures. But what you're experiencing right now, if you're in this state, doesn't have a clear photograph. Nothing dramatic happened. You didn't lose anything externally. In fact, from the outside, everything might look perfectly fine, maybe even better than fine. You're still functioning. You're still reliable. You're still present. But internally, something has shifted. And that shift is so subtle, so gradual, that you almost didn't notice it until one day you realized, I don't care the way I used to. Not in an angry way, not in a rebellious way, just in a quiet, unsettling way. The things that used to make your heart beat a little faster now leave you neutral. The ambitions that used to pull you out of bed now feel like obligations you're fulfilling for a stranger. Jung observed this phenomenon carefully in his patients and in himself. He noticed that human beings are not static structures. We're living processes, constantly moving, constantly reorganizing. And the energy that fuels our interest, our passion, our drive, what Jung called libido but meant as psychic energy rather than just sexual energy, that energy has a mind of its own. It doesn't belong to your ego. It doesn't answer to your plans. It flows where life is asking it to flow. And when a certain way of living has reached its natural end, that energy begins to withdraw. Think of it like a river. For years, that river has carved a path through the landscape. It's cut deep into the earth. It knows exactly where to go. But underground, shifts are happening. The terrain is changing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the water begins to find new routes. Not because anything is wrong with the old riverbed. Not because the river is broken. But because the landscape itself no longer supports that path the way it once did. You are that river. And the loss of interest you're feeling isn't a failure. It's a redirection. Your psychic energy is no longer willing to pour itself into channels that have become obsolete. And the first sign of that redirection is almost always this: you stop caring about things the way you used to. I worked with someone once, let's call him Daniel. Daniel was a high school teacher. Not just any teacher, the kind of teacher students remember years later. He brought passion into the classroom. He stayed late. He designed creative lessons. He genuinely believed he was shaping young minds, and for a long time, that belief carried him. But somewhere in his 15th year of teaching, something began to fade. Not his competence. He was still excellent at his job. Not his relationships with students. They still respected him. But the feeling of "this is where I belong" had quietly evaporated. Daniel described it as living inside a photograph of himself. He looked right, sounded right, acted right, but he wasn't really there. And what confused him most was that he didn't hate teaching. He didn't want to quit. He just no longer felt alive inside it. There was no enemy, no conflict, no villain. Just a slow cooling of something that had once burned hot. From a conventional perspective, Daniel needed a vacation, or a hobby, or maybe a career coach. But Jung would have looked at Daniel and said something very different. He would have said that Daniel's psyche had completed a cycle. The version of himself that needed to be the passionate teacher, the one who derived identity from that role, had served its purpose. And now, something deeper was stirring. Something that couldn't be expressed through lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences. But that something hadn't yet taken shape. So all Daniel could feel was the absence of the old feeling, not the presence of a new one. This is the crux of the misunderstanding. We're trained to believe that when we stop feeling interest, something is wrong. We rush to fill the gap. We look for new hobbies, new goals, new relationships. We try to reignite the old fire. But Jung suggests a radically different approach. What if the fire went out because the fuel was spent? What if the reason you can't get interested in the old things is because those old things have nothing left to teach you? Jung once wrote something that cuts to the heart of this experience. He said, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the center of the whole personality." Most of us live as if our conscious mind, our plans, our goals, our identities are the whole story. But Jung knew that beneath consciousness lies a vast terrain of unconscious life. And when that deeper terrain begins to shift, the ego feels it first as a kind of disorientation. The signals it's used to receiving, interest, ambition, desire, begin to weaken. And because the ego can only interpret this as loss, it panics. But from the perspective of the whole personality, nothing is lost. Energy is simply moving. It's withdrawing from the surface to feed the depths. And if you can learn to stay with that withdrawal without immediately trying to reverse it, you might discover that what feels like emptiness is actually a space being cleared for something real. Think of it like a theater. When a play ends, the lights go down. The stage goes dark. Someone walking in at that moment might think nothing is happening. But behind the curtain, stagehands are working. Sets are being dismantled. New props are being brought in. The darkness isn't emptiness. It's preparation. Losing interest is that darkness. It's the space between acts. And what matters most in that space is not how quickly you can start the next play, but whether you're willing to let the old one truly end. If you're in this space right now, the most important thing you can do is stop treating it as a problem. Stop asking, how do I get back to normal? Start asking a much quieter question. What if this withdrawal is trying to show me something? Not everything that feels like a loss actually is one. Some losses are just the old making room for the deeper. And the fact that you can observe this happening, the fact that you're aware enough to notice you've lost interest, is itself proof that you haven't collapsed. You're just no longer identified with what once defined you. If what I'm describing resonates, if you felt that strange distance from your own life, leave a word in the comments. Just something simple. I'm noticing. Sometimes the first step isn't fixing, it's acknowledging. Section 2. The world's misunderstanding. Now here's where things get complicated. Because even if you manage to sit with this withdrawal without panicking, the world around you won't. And this is where many people get pulled back into patterns that no longer fit, not because they want to, but because the pressure to be normal becomes unbearable. Jung understood something that modern culture has almost completely forgotten. There are phases of human development that look like illness, but aren't. There are states of withdrawal that look like failure, but are actually the deepest kind of work. But our society has no category for these states. We have categories for depression, anxiety, burnout, midlife crisis, but we don't have a category for the soul is reorganizing itself and needs you to be still. Think about how we respond when someone says they've lost interest in everything. The immediate response is almost always solution-oriented. Have you tried therapy? Have you considered medication? Maybe you need a new job. Maybe you need to exercise more. Maybe you need to travel. All of these suggestions come from a genuine place of caring, but they also come from a deep discomfort with emptiness. We can't stand to see someone standing still. We need them to be moving, striving, wanting again. Jung saw this cultural discomfort and recognized it as one of the greatest obstacles to genuine transformation. He wrote something that still stings with truth. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. What he meant is that when we refuse to go through the real pain of transformation, the pain of not knowing, the pain of losing old identities, the pain of standing in the dark, that refusal doesn't make the pain disappear. It just turns it into symptoms. The suffering that should have been a passage becomes a prison. The world's biggest misunderstanding about losing interest is this. It treats the symptom as the disease. When you lose interest, the world says something is wrong with you. Fix it. But Jung would say something is right with you. You're finally refusing to pour your life into structures that have run dry. The loss of interest isn't the problem. It's the signal that the problem, the real problem of living inauthentically, is being addressed. In Norse mythology, there's a story that captures this perfectly. Odin, the king of the gods, doesn't become wise through triumph. He becomes wise through sacrifice. He hangs himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. No food, no water, no power, pierced by his own spear. From the outside, this looks like defeat. The greatest of the gods, suspended, suffering, dying. But it's precisely in that state of complete surrender that Odin receives the runes, the deepest knowledge in all of existence. He had to lose everything to gain what couldn't be gained any other way. If Odin lived today, people would rush to cut him down. They'd call an ambulance. They'd insist he see someone. They'd tell him he doesn't need to suffer. He just needs to adjust his mindset. And in saving him, they'd rob him of his transformation. This is the paradox we're living in. We're so uncomfortable with darkness that we extinguish the very conditions under which wisdom grows. Jung wasn't suggesting that all suffering is meaningful or that all withdrawal is transformative. He was too precise for that. He distinguished carefully between pathological disintegration, where a person loses the capacity for reflection, and transformative withdrawal, where a person remains lucid but disidentified. In pathological disintegration, you can't observe yourself. In transformative withdrawal, you can. You're watching yourself from a distance. You're noticing that the old motivations no longer move you. That capacity for observation is the difference between breakdown and breakthrough. But the world doesn't make that distinction. It sees stillness and assumes stagnation. It sees silence and assumes emptiness. It sees withdrawal and assumes depression. And if you're not careful, you'll start believing those assumptions yourself. You'll start pathologizing your own deepest process. You'll think something is wrong, when actually something is finally right. Consider a fever. A fever isn't the illness. It's the body's response to the illness. It's the immune system doing its work. But if you only treat the fever and ignore what's causing it, you haven't helped. You've just suppressed the symptom. Loss of interest is the same. It's the psyche's immune response to a way of living that's no longer viable. But the world wants to suppress the symptom. It wants you interested, motivated, productive again. It doesn't care whether the life you're returning to is actually yours. This is why Jung's work remains so radical. He refused to pathologize the very experiences that open us to depth. He saw that the loss of interest, the withdrawal from the world, the dark night of the soul, these aren't mistakes in the system. They are the system's way of correcting itself when we've lived too long on the surface. If you're in this state, the most important protection you can give yourself is understanding. Understand that what you're going through doesn't fit neatly into the categories the world offers. Understand that the pressure you feel to return to normal isn't coming from your soul. It's coming from a culture that fears depth. And understand that just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes the discomfort is the sign that you're finally in the right place. Section 3. The withdrawal of energy. So let's go deeper now. Let's look at what's actually happening beneath the surface when you lose interest. Because it's not random. It's not meaningless. It's one of the most precise movements the psyche makes. Jung used the term libido to describe psychic energy, the life force that animates our interests, our passions, our attachments. And he observed that this energy flows according to its own logic. It doesn't obey the ego's commands. You can't force yourself to care about something just because you should. You can't manufacture passion through willpower. The energy either flows or it doesn't. And when it stops flowing into something, that something has lost its living connection to you. Now here's what's crucial to understand. Libido isn't loyal to your self-image. It's loyal to your wholeness. It will continue to flow into a role, a relationship, a goal, only as long as that container can hold the full weight of who you're becoming. But when you outgrow that container, when the role no longer fits the reality of your inner life, the energy begins to withdraw. Not because anything is wrong, but because the container has reached its limit. Imagine a tree. For years, sap has flowed into a particular branch. That branch has borne fruit. It's been strong and productive. But as the tree grows, new patterns emerge. The canopy shifts. Light reaches different places. And gradually, the sap begins to flow less into that old branch and more into new growth. To someone who doesn't understand trees, that old branch looks like it's failing. But to someone who understands, it's simply that the tree's life is reorganizing itself. The old branch has completed its contribution. You are that tree. And the parts of your life that no longer receive your energy, your career, your relationships, your ambitions, aren't necessarily dying. They're just no longer where your life is flowing. The ego, which has identified with those branches, experiences this as loss. But the self, the deeper center of your being, experiences it as growth. Jung once said something that illuminates this perfectly. Whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. What he meant is that when we refuse to consciously let go of something, when we cling to roles and identities that have completed their purpose, that energy doesn't just disappear. It shows up externally. We get sick. We have accidents. We find ourselves in situations that force the change we wouldn't make voluntarily. The loss of interest you're feeling might actually be a mercy. It's the psyche's way of withdrawing energy gently, giving you time to notice, to adjust, to prepare, rather than having the change forced upon you through crisis. I think again of Daniel, the teacher I mentioned earlier. He didn't make any dramatic changes when he first noticed his interest fading. He didn't quit his job or blow up his life. He just sat with the feeling. He admitted to himself that he no longer felt alive inside that role. And for Jung, that admission was already a profound shift. Because Daniel stopped identifying completely with the teacher persona. He created a little space between himself and his role. And in that space, something new could eventually grow. This is the part that's hard to grasp when you're in the middle of it. You want answers. You want direction. You want to know what comes next. But the withdrawal of energy isn't asking you to know. It's asking you to wait. It's asking you to tolerate not knowing. Because if you rush to fill the emptiness with a new identity, a new goal, a new story about yourself, you'll just be repeating the same pattern in different packaging. The old structure will be replaced by another structure. But the deeper work of finding out who you actually are will remain undone. Jung saw this constantly in his practice. People would come to him after losing interest in their lives, desperate to find something new to care about, and he would slow them down. He would help them stay with the emptiness. Because he knew that what feels like an abyss is often a womb. Something is being gestated. But gestation takes time, and it takes darkness. You can't rush a birth. The practical implication here is simple but not easy. When you notice energy withdrawing from parts of your life, don't immediately try to redirect it. Don't force yourself to care. Don't manufacture interest. Just notice. Notice where you feel neutral, where you once felt passion. Notice where you're going through the motions. Notice what feels hollow. And instead of judging that hollowness as a problem, let it be information. Your psyche is telling you, in the only way it can, that something has completed its cycle. This doesn't mean you have to quit your job or end your relationships tomorrow. It means you stop lying to yourself about them. You stop pretending you feel what you used to feel. And in that honesty, you create the conditions for something real to eventually emerge. If you're still with me, if this is touching something you've been carrying, leave a word in the comments. Just I'm here. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply witness our own process without rushing to fix it. Section 4. The Dark Night and the Fall of the Mask. Now we arrive at the deepest part of this journey. The point where loss of interest isn't just about specific things anymore. It becomes something larger. You don't just lose interest in your job or your hobbies. You begin to feel like a stranger inside your own life. The mask you've worn, the persona you've presented to the world, starts to feel like it belongs to someone else. Jung used the term persona to describe the social face we wear. It comes from the Latin word for the masks ancient actors wore in theater. And Jung understood that the persona is necessary. You can't walk through the world without one. You need to be able to function in society, to play roles, to meet expectations. But the danger comes when you forget that the mask isn't your face, when you start believing that the role you play is who you really are. For years, maybe decades, you've worn a particular mask. Maybe it's the successful professional. Maybe it's the devoted parent. Maybe it's the strong one who never falls apart. Maybe it's the caretaker who always puts others first. And that mask has served you. It's helped you navigate the world. It's given you a place to stand. But masks aren't designed to last forever. They're designed for particular stages of the journey. And when that stage ends, the mask begins to feel heavy, false, suffocating. The loss of interest you're experiencing might actually be the mask losing its power. The persona, which was once lit from within by your psychic energy, is now dark. You're still wearing it, still performing the role, but there's no life behind it anymore. And this is terrifying, because if you've identified with that mask for a long time, its emptiness feels like your emptiness. You don't realize that the mask is empty, not you. This state has been described across spiritual traditions as the dark night of the soul. Not because it's dramatic or painful in an obvious way, but because it's disorienting. The landmarks that once told you who you are have disappeared. The definitions that once held you steady have dissolved. You're standing in a fog, unable to see forward or backward, unable to recognize yourself in the mirror of your old life. Franz Kafka captured this with haunting precision in The Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into an insect. But the real horror of the story isn't the physical transformation. It's the gradual dissolution of every role that defined him. He can no longer be the provider for his family. He can no longer be the dutiful son. He can no longer be the reliable worker. One by one, the masks fall away, and what's left is something unrecognizable, even to himself. This is a mythic image of what happens when the persona dissolves. The roles that held you in place, that told you who you were and how to behave, they stop working. And without them, you feel like Gregor. Alien, disconnected, lost. But Kafka's story is also a warning. Gregor never moves beyond the dissolution. He never finds a new way of being. He just shrinks and dies. And that's what happens when we can't tolerate the emptiness, when we can't stay with the dissolution long enough for something new to form. Jung believed that this stage, as uncomfortable as it is absolutely necessary for genuine transformation. The old self has to die. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually. The person you've been, the one built from expectations and adaptations and survival strategies, that person has to fall away so that someone real can emerge, and the falling away almost always feels like loss. Because from the perspective of the old self, it is loss. It's the loss of everything that self was built on. But here's what makes Jung's perspective so different from simple pessimism. He didn't see this dissolution as the end. He saw it as the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, beneath all the masks, beneath all the roles, beneath all the shoulds and musts and have-tos. Think of a caterpillar in a chrysalis. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. Just a still, dark shell. But inside, the caterpillar is completely dissolving. Its old form is breaking down into organic mush. If the caterpillar could think, it would probably feel like it was dying. And in a sense, it is. The caterpillar self is dying, so that the butterfly self can be born. But the death isn't the end. It's the necessary precondition for a completely different kind of life. You're in the chrysalis right now. The old form is dissolving. And it feels like death, because, for the person you used to be, it is. But what's emerging isn't nothing. It's just not visible yet. It's not nameable yet. It's not definable yet. And the deepest mistake you can make in this phase is to try to crawl back into the old form, to force yourself to be the caterpillar again, because at least the caterpillar knew who it was. The dark night isn't asking you to know. It's asking you to not know. It's asking you to tolerate the ambiguity, to sit in the uncertainty, to let the old masks fall without immediately grabbing for new ones. Because any mask you grab now will just be another persona, another adaptation, another way of not being real. And the whole point of this journey is to become real. I've sat with people in this phase. I've watched them struggle against the emptiness, try to fill it with new projects, new relationships, new identities. And every time, the emptiness just reappears in a different form, because you can't fill a soul-shaped void with more roles. You can only fill it by letting something genuine emerge from the depths. And that takes time. It takes patience. It takes a willingness to stay in the dark. If you're in this place, if the masks are falling and you don't know who you are without them, try not to panic. Try not to rebuild too quickly. Just stay. Let the old forms dissolve. Let yourself not know. Because what's coming, what's slowly being formed in the darkness, is more real than anything you've worn before. Section 5. Individuation and the quiet rebirth. And this brings us to the final stage, the point where the loss of interest that felt like an ending reveals itself as a beginning. The point where the emptiness you've been sitting with starts to show its shape. Not as a clear answer, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, quiet reorientation of your entire being. Jung called this process individuation. It's not a technique or a goal you achieve. It's the natural outcome of living honestly long enough. It's what happens when you stop letting the world tell you who you should be and start discovering who you actually are. And paradoxically, individuation almost never begins with excitement or inspiration. It begins with withdrawal, with not caring about the things you used to care about, with no longer being pulled by the same ambitions, with a kind of holy indifference to the surface of life. This is why the loss of interest you've been experiencing isn't your enemy. It's your ally. It's the force that's been pulling you back from a life that wasn't really yours. It's the energy that's been clearing space for something genuine to grow. And if you've stayed with it, if you haven't rushed to fill the emptiness, you might be starting to notice something subtle happening. Not a new passion necessarily, not a new direction, but a different quality of presence. You're less desperate now, less hungry for validation, less willing to pretend. The things that once upset you don't land the same way. The opinions that once mattered have lost their weight. You're not trying to prove anything anymore. And in that not trying, something real is starting to breathe. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming a psychological individual, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. But he wasn't talking about becoming isolated or disconnected from others. He was talking about becoming so solid in yourself that you can finally relate to the world without losing yourself in it. The mask falls away, and what's left isn't nothing. What's left is you. The you that was always there, underneath all the adaptations, underneath all the performances, underneath all the ways you learned to be acceptable. Think of someone who's lived their whole life in a room with artificial light, bright, constant, but somehow flat. Everything is visible, but nothing has depth. Then one day, the artificial lights begin to dim. At first, it's frightening. The room gets dark, shapes become uncertain. But slowly, as the eyes adjust, a different kind of light begins to enter. Moonlight through a window, dawn creeping under the door. And in this softer light, you start to see things you never noticed before. The grain of the wood, the texture of the walls, the subtle beauty that was always there but couldn't be seen under the harsh glare of artificial illumination. Individuation is like that. When the harsh light of ambition and approval and social expectation begins to fade, you start to see yourself differently. Not as a collection of achievements and roles, but as a presence. A living, breathing, feeling presence that doesn't need to prove anything. And from this place, the choices you make are different. Not because you've found better goals, but because you're no longer choosing from desperation. You're choosing from clarity. Jung said something that captures the essence of this transformation. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Notice he didn't say the goal of a lifetime or the achievement of a lifetime. He said the privilege. Because becoming who you truly are isn't something you accomplish. It's something you're given. It's the gift that comes when you finally stop trying to be who you're not. And the path to that gift runs straight through the loss of interest you've been fearing. The indifference to old goals. The withdrawal from old roles. The dissolution of old masks. These aren't obstacles to becoming real. They're the very process by which realness emerges. You can't add authenticity to a fake life. You can only subtract what's fake until authenticity is all that's left. If you've been on this journey, if you've stayed with the withdrawal instead of running from it, you might be noticing a strange paradox. You're doing less, but you're more present. You're wanting less, but you're appreciating more. You're striving less, but you're living more fully in the moments that matter. This is what individuation feels like in daily life. Not dramatic transformation, but quiet reorientation. Not a new and improved version of the old self, but a completely different relationship to being alive. I think again of Daniel, the teacher who no longer felt alive in his classroom. He didn't quit teaching immediately. He didn't find a new passion. But something shifted in how he taught. He stopped trying to be the inspiring teacher. He stopped performing. He just showed up, fully present, without the mask. And to his surprise, students responded differently. Not because he was more entertaining, but because he was more real. The energy that had withdrawn from the old role was now flowing into simple presence. And presence, it turns out, is more powerful than performance. This is what's waiting for you on the other side of this journey. Not a life that's more exciting, necessarily. Not a life that's more successful by external measures, but a life that's more yours. A life where the things you do and the person you are no longer in conflict. A life where you don't have to leave yourself behind to function in the world. And when you reach this place, you'll look back at the loss of interest that once frightened you and see it differently. You'll see it not as the problem, but as the solution. Not as the breakdown, but as the breakthrough. Not as the death of your life, but as the birth of yourself. Conclusion. So here we are at the end of this conversation. Not with a checklist of things to do. Not with 5 steps to get your motivation back, but with something far more valuable. A new way of understanding what's been happening to you. The loss of interest you've been experiencing isn't a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that you've completed something. A phase of life. A way of being. A mask that no longer fits. And the emptiness you've been feeling isn't a void to be filled. It's a space being cleared. A clearing where something genuine can eventually grow. Jung spent his life helping people understand these passages. He knew that the soul has its own rhythm, its own seasons. And just as winter isn't the failure of spring, the withdrawal of your energy isn't the failure of your life. It's the necessary pause, the necessary darkness, the necessary fallow period before a new kind of growth. What matters now isn't that you find new things to care about. What matters is that you stop pretending to care about things that no longer reach you. What matters is that you let the old forms complete their cycle without rushing to rebuild. What matters is that you trust, even just a little, that what's happening isn't destruction, it's preparation. If this video has touched something in you, if it's given language to an experience you've been carrying alone, take a moment to mark that, not for me, but for yourself. A like, a comment, a subscription. Not as a transaction, but as a recognition. A way of saying, I see what's happening. I'm staying with it. I'm not running. The next videos on this channel will continue in this rhythm. Slow, deep, honest about the inner journey. Not because there's anything wrong with motivation and excitement, but because there's a deeper layer most of us never reach. A layer where the questions change. Where what should I do becomes, who am I becoming? And if you're ready for those questions, you're in the right place. Thank you for staying until the end, for giving this material your attention, for being willing to sit with ideas that don't offer quick fixes. And no matter what the next chapter of your life looks like, I hope you walk through it without having to leave yourself behind.